I have finally had some time to play around with the newest class for LOTRO, the Mariner class, and this video will be pretty much a complete guide for the Mariner, where we'll look at which stats and which items you should try to aim for as a Mariner. We'll look at the 3 different trait lines, the blue support group trait line, the red DPS line, and the yellow debuffing line. We will look at virtues, we'll look at legendary items, we're also going to look at basic rotations and how you would play each line differently. So hopefully this video will make it easier for you to pick up this class and play it. If you do like the video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And let's not waste any more time and let's get into the Mariner. Before diving deeper into the class, it's important to understand how you build and gear a Mariner. So Mariner is unique in that it actually has the reworked stats on it, the stats that we saw on beta a while ago, and it will be the only class for now who will have this system. But it's not really a problem for the Mariner. To put it quite simply, as with pretty much any class, Vitality will increase your morale, Fate will increase your power. These two are pretty straightforward. The question comes to the main stats, and if you look at the main stats, you can see what they give. As we can see, from every point of might, you get 3 physical mastery rating, you get 1 physical mitigation, 2 parry, and 1 evade. The parry and evade we don't really need because we're not a tank. The physical mitigation is nice, so let's count this as 4 points of value, 3 points of value from the physical mastery, 1 point in mitigations. If we then look at agility, you can see that just like might, you get 3 points into physical mastery, but you also get 1 point into critical rating, and there's also 1 point in finesse. There's some parry and evade, but we don't really care about that as a Mariner. The big thing here is the mastery, crit, and finesse. So that's 5 points of value compared to the 4 points of value from might, leaving agility to be the clear best stat for a DPS Mariner. Looking at will, you can see that it does give a physical mastery rating. It also gives some outgoing healing and tactical mitigations and resistant. So this is more of a defensive stat, or for a yellow support Mariner, and a little bit for the blue Mariner. So it's quite possible that we'll see on set gear that the red set gear will have agility on it, and then might maybe on the blue or will on the yellow. Not quite sure how that will look, but if we just forget about set bonus and all that stuff, which stat do you want to go for as a Mariner? Agility. Pretty much for any line, you just want to get agility. It gives by far the best value for the stats that you're looking for as a Mariner. So if you're gearing up a Mariner, aim for gear that gives you agility. Agility is much better than might and will. Now when it comes to the Mariner and the gear that they get, most of it is pretty straightforward. You have your typical earrings, your necklace, your bracelets, your rings, and your pocket item, and you have your armor slots and your cloak. Pretty standard on the sides, nothing different from every other class. If we look at the bottom here, we have of course the legendary item, the sword, and we have the legendary item, the haversack. There's of course your crafting tool, and then we have 2 slots left. Mariner does have an offhand, and in this slot you can put a dagger, and this dagger is actually not contributing to your DPS, it's simply there for stats. DPS comes from your main hand weapon, and the dagger is just for extra stats. So when you're looking for the best offhand to have on your Mariner, don't look at the DPS, instead look at the agility, vitality, mastery, crit rating, the stats below. This is basically a buff stick for your class. For DPS, you will always be covered by your legendary item sword. Obviously, if you're low level and leveling up, the main hand sword will matter for your DPS. Which brings us to the last slot, the range slot, and Mariners will actually equip flutes in their range slot, such as this pristine Carndoom Flute of Mysteries. You can see that the class is Mariner, so in your range slot you will get a flute, and obviously with the new expansion coming up, there will be craftable flutes dropping for sure, and probably flutes dropping from instances as well. You can see that I haven't gotten around to getting one for myself yet, but since we're so close to an expansion, I'm not really too worried about that. But to reiterate, your jewelry is standard, your armor is standard, your main hand sword is what controls your DPS, your offhand dagger is a buff stick, just giving you stats, doesn't really contribute to your DPS. In your range slot, you have a flute, and of course you have your typical crafting tool, and your haversack in your class item slot. One of the most asked questions in my Discord about the Mariner is which virtues should you use for your Mariner, and for me it's still pretty simple. As a Mariner, you're typically gonna play a role where you deal damage, so you want to get some DPS stats like Mastery, Finesse, and Critical Rating, while also sprinkling in with some mitigations. You do of course want to go for the maximum value from your virtues as well. So to get the maximum value for the stats that you want as a DPS Mariner, I would recommend getting the Wit for the Finesse, Crit Rating, and Mastery, Fidelity for the high Vitality and the good mitigations, Valor gives more Mastery, Finesse, Crit Rating, Compassion gives great value in mitigations, and Confidence gives you some more Critical Rating and Finesse. So these 5 virtues will be the best for your Mariner in my opinion. The only time I might consider going a bit more tanky would be if you played Yellow Mariner, but I think these 5 will be fine for any line that you pick. When it comes to the legendary items for Mariner, I already made a video about this, a video where I only look at the legendary items, but I thought I would include that in this video as well. And there's also some things I want to point out, some differences from this video. When it comes to your heraldric traceries, I would definitely recommend going for the heraldry of the Keen Serpent. It has agility and it gives you the critical hit chance bonus. There's always the option of going for the Stalwart Sparrow for the mitigations, or just the Sparrow if you can't get these special recipes. But 2 of the Keen Serpent for the crit chance is definitely my recommendation, because we'll see that later on the Words of Craft, why I think you want to have the crit on your heraldries. Words of Power are pretty straightforward, and I think you can use this for any line. You want to get both of the AoE damage, AoE attack damage, and AoE attack criticals. You want to get both single target attack damage, single target attack criticals, and you also want to add damage over time, as the Mariner does have bleeds. This leads us to the Words of Masteries. So this is where I wanted to mention some things I didn't really mention in the other video. Whereas if you want to just do a one set of allies, you can just get these 12 in my opinion, and you'll do just fine in blue, in red, and in yellow. The only thing I would consider adding would be Salt Sea Blade debuff duration. When it comes to the top 6, I think they're pretty much must have in any line. They increase your damage by a lot. But this is what I would get if you want to get allies and play every single line. If you're playing Red Mariner, there's 3 traceries you obviously don't need. Star Guidance, Jugglery, and Thrum of the Sea. There are blue, yellow, and yellow. In that case, you would add back Salt Sea Blade debuff duration, and probably toss a bottle cooldown, and then perhaps bottle healing, or defensive swordplay buff durations if you prefer that. But I'd probably add bottle healing. This is for a purely a red build. If you're gonna have a pure blue build, I would just simply remove bottle healing and add back star guidance duration. And this would be the blue Mariner build for masteries. The traceries on the left are traceries I think you don't really need at all. They're not really that great. So you can safely ignore the ones on the left. Not really something I would recommend. And if you want to go for a pure yellow build, you want to add the Jugglery and Thrum of the Sea. You obviously don't need the blue tracery in yellow. Jugglery goes back in. And once again, to add Thrum of the Sea, you either remove, let's say, Tossabot cooldown, or even Salt Sea Blade debuff duration. Let's say that we'll just remove Toss a Bottle and add Thrum of the Sea. You could even drop Salt Sea Blade and put Toss a Bottle in. Doesn't make that big of a difference. But this would be the yellow build I would recommend. But like I said, if you want to play all the lines of Mariner, you could easily go with these 12. And you could always consider adding Star Guidance Duration instead of Salt Sea. But luckily, Mariner for Word of Masteries is pretty forgiving, and there aren't really that many must-have. I would say like all the damaged ones are must-have for any line, And there are some really good ones for all the lines, and then there are some interchangeable. But what you're seeing right here would be my recommendation for every line of the Mariner. And the final thing we're going to look at is the words of craft. I recommended that you get the crit in your heraldries. That means you don't need the heroic precision, which means you can get the Gundabad word of craft tactics, heal and gold so they stack together. This will increase the damage of your bleeds and it's pretty good for Mariner. And of course the Ascendant Flame for the fire type damage, as the Mariner has a couple of skills that deals fire damage over time. So for Mariner I would recommend these four as your words of craft. So next up it's time to look at the rotation, the base rotation that I figured out. I've kind of figured out a static rotation. We're going to look at red first because red is like the baseline for everything. And then blue and yellow are kind of like, they're not copies of red, but they're really similar. But I'm going to start off with red to get an idea of the basic rotation as a Mariner. First off, I should mention that in my rotation, I'm not using skills like disengage, blade shield, on guard, dodge, or riposte, or check step. These skills are not part of my rotation, not even as fillers, because I've found that they're a bit too slow or not really worth using at all. So we're gonna look at my bars. Obviously I have skills like my cleanse, belly of brine, corruption removal. We're not gonna focus that much on these skills. Instead, we're gonna focus on these skills right here, like my main rotation skills. So what you see here, H-tagged, are the top 2 bars, the 5 skills right here. On the top we have the maintenance skills, fire pot, breath of fire. These are both bleeds, damage over time, fire damage over time, that you want to try to keep up at all times. The North Wind is another maintenance buff, but it's the crit defense debuff. It's not as high priority. Fire pot is like your main priority, then breath of fire. North Wind you use whenever you have room for it in your rotation. On the next line we have your toggle skills. This toggle skill, Shanty Steady Aft, basically pushes your balance backwards. So it's really helpful because you're going to DPS, you're going to push your balance to the 4, but it will help keep you somewhat towards aft. You definitely want to keep this active while DPSing. The other skill is usually Shanty 4, which will do the opposite of this and push you forwards. But if you're playing Redline, this is going to change into a DPS cooldown. 15-second duration will increase the pips, so it'll really push your bar towards the 4. It also give you run speed buff and melee damage buff, so definitely a cooldown you should be using. On your next 2 bars that you can see here, I've H-tagged the skills. These are like your main DPS skills that you're going to be using. Your main priority combination will be the Feint Compound Lunge into Recenter, which is these 4 skills. So the idea is to do Feint. Feint is an immediate skill. Feint will increase the compound attack critical chance. That's why you do Feint into Compound. The Compound with its 3 attacks will deal good damage, and of course with the increased crit chance will deal more damage. And we want to use Compound into Lunge because Compound gives the ability for Lunge to apply a really strong bleed. It also reduces the cooldown of Lunge. So if Lunge is almost off cooldown, you can safely hit Compound and Lunge should just come off cooldown. After Lunge, you want to use Recenter, and every time you use Recenter should be after Lunge. Use Lunge as a reminder to Recenter because Lunge has a 15-second cooldown, which will refresh all your balance buffs that also last for 15 seconds. So Feint, Compound, Lunge into Recenter is your main priority in this rotation. After using Recenter, you should always apply Salt Sea Blade. It has the same duration as the Lunge cooldown. So if you always do Feint, Compound, Lunge, Recenter into Salt Sea Blade, you'll always have the Salt Sea Blade active on your target. Obviously, if you have more than one target, like if you're fighting ads, you might want to use this skill more often. Since the cooldown of the skill is only 7 seconds, you can apply this to multiple targets. But if you're only fighting one target, you always want to do Feint, Compound, Lunge, Recenter, Salt Sea Blade. Marked Foes is another debuff you can apply to your enemies. It has a max targets of 7, so it is AoE, and it gives 5% incoming damage to your target and also deals damage. And we don't really care about the effects that Marked Foes does because we're not going to use it for that effect. we're just going to use marked foes for the 5% incoming damage. Obviously, if you're only fighting one target and there's a red captain with telling mark, you're not going to be using this skill at all, because this effect does not stack with the captain's telling mark. Instead, you're just going to have the captain keep the telling mark, and you're just going to ignore this skill if it's a single target boss fight. Now, we've established that this is your main priority: Faint, Compound, Lunge, Recenter, Soul Sea Blade. Marked foes is something you should just refresh every time it comes off cooldown, but of course, like I told you, you need to know if there's a telling mark. You don't really have to do it, but in AoE situations you pretty much spam this anyways. But this has a 20-second duration. It's something you should probably track and then refresh once it's about to fall off. Now, with your priority out of the way, next line, Thrust Sweeping Advance is your bread and butter as a Mariner. Thrust has impact on a lot of skills. As we can see, obviously Thrust increases advanced damage and also makes Advance apply a bleed, so you should always do Thrust into Advance. Also, Thrust should be a skill that you weave in between most uses of skills, like if you refresh your Fire Bleeds, Fire Bleed 1, Thrust, Fire Bleed 2, Thrust, Northwind, and so on. Obviously, if you're doing the big combos, like the top one or this combo, you're not going to be putting Thrust in between those, obviously, but between most skills, you want to do Thrust, Sweeping, Thrust, Rummage, Thrust, Marked Foes, Thrust, Firepot, Thrust, Breath of Fire, Thrust, North Wind, etc, etc. So think of Thrust as a skill that you're going to be spamming quite a lot. So like I said, you always want to do Thrust into Sweeping Advance when Sweeping Advance is off cooldown. You also want to do Thrust when you go into the other combo. So you want to do Thrust, Sweeping. Sweeping will go on cooldown for 4 seconds. Go back to Thrust. And then you go to the next combo, Aggressive Strike, because Thrust increases Aggressive Strike damage by 25% and also single target attack damage by 10%. Aggressive Strike is single target. So you're going to do Thrust into Aggressive Strike. Aggressive Strike will deal damage. And Aggressive Strike also makes Cut Over do 50% more damage. So in that case, you're going to go into Cut Over. Cut Over deals damage. It also makes the next skill, Flesh, apply latent damage, which is a short burst bleed. So then you do Cut Over into Flesh, and Flesh is your other finisher. Now remember, you're not going to recenter after Flesh. Recenter happens after Lunge. So once you hit your second combo, you're then going to go back to Thrust, maybe Sweeping, Thrust, other skills. But obviously when this combo is ready to go again, when Lunge is almost about to get off cooldown, you then do this as your priority. Boom, 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 boom. Mark foes whenever you need it. Then you go back to Thrust, Sweeping, Thrust, Skill, Thrust, Skill. And then, of course, when this combo is ready, with Flesh coming off cooldown, you then do Thrust into Aggressive, Cut Over, Flesh. Cut Over is also a skill you can use twice between every Flesh. If you pay attention while Flesh is on cooldown, Cut Over is on cooldown. Once Cut Over comes back, after 10 seconds, you can then hit Cut Over once again. So I would then probably recommend doing Thrust, Cut Over, and then Cut Over will be ready for the next use of Flesh. That's the base rotation. Obviously, if you have questions, you can ask in the comments. Rummage is another filler skill that you want to use. You want to use it to get the random skill, and the skill that you're going to fish for is the Rummage Knife, which will apply another bleed. We'll see that in the example that I'm going to show real soon. But this is the base rotation that I came up with, where Faint, Compound, Lunge, Recenter, Salty Blade is your main priority combo. Then Marked Foes reapplied every 20 seconds when it's about to fall off. If there's a red captain with Telling Mark and only one target that you're fighting, you don't have to use the skill at all. And after your main combo is done, you then have Thrust, Sweeping, Thrust, Aggressive, Cut Over, Flesh. Try to get the second Cut Over before Flesh comes back, so you can do Cut Over twice between every Flesh use. Other than that, it's all about Thrust, Skill, Thrust, Skill, Thrust, Skill. Just Thrust, alternate other skills in between. Thrust and then alternate with other skills until your combos are ready. Once Lunge is getting like 3/4 of the way of your cooldown, you then go feint, compound, lunge into your main combo, then back to thrust. If flesh is about to come off cooldown, you of course do thrust, aggressive, cutover, flesh. And that is your main rotation as a redline mariner. I also want to mention, if you happen to be in an AoE situation, your rotation should change a little bit. Obviously, thrust sweeping is still really good because sweeping is AoE, which would then apply the bleed to all those targets. So thrust sweeping should be used off cooldown in AoE situations. The other thing that will change is that your main combo will then only be compound into lunge and recenter. You're going to use feint for something else. Feint will then make cutover become AoE. So in AoE situations, you should do feint and then into cutover, which will give cutover the ability to be AoE. And then of course, cutover into flesh. And then once cutover is back off cooldown and feint is back off cooldown, you then do feint cutover. And for your next feint cutover, flesh should be back again. And just rinse, repeat. Thrust sweeping off cooldown for AoE. And obviously, marked foes as well is an AoE skill, should also be used off cooldown in AoE situations. And also, if you're in AoE situations, you're always going to do feint cutover, which kind of make aggressive strike a filler skill for AoE situations. You will then just do thrust into aggressive whenever it's off cooldown. But that's the main idea with the rotation that I came up with. I'm getting pretty good results with it. It feels pretty good. I'm not saying that it's the rotation, like the best rotation, but it's a good rotation, good static rotation for people to learn the class and get used to the skills. So I did an example rotation on my Red Mariner, and just to explain, the opening rotation that I do is always fire bleed, then your mid debuff, marked foes, then I do my cooldown, and then I start the big combo, then I go into the thrust, sweeping, thrust, other combo, and then thrust every skill, thrust skill, thrust skill. And then you just do your combos once they're off cooldown. Sometimes during the fight, the lunge and flesh finishers will kind of align and come off cooldown on the same time. Always prioritize lunge. This is your main prioritization. I'm just going to play this in slow-mo and just try to talk a little bit about it while it happens. So as I told, both fire bleeds, mid debuff, incoming damage debuff, cooldown, main combo, boom, 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 recenter, thrust, sweeping, thrust, second combo. And after this, it's now all about thrust, skill, thrust, skill. So you'll see me doing thrust, sweeping. I fish for the rummage knife, thrust, skill, thrust. And I can see that this combo is ready. So I do feint, compound, combo, recenter, mid debuff. Also mark foes is about to come off cooldown. So I then go back into thrust, sweeping, thrust, skill. And I think I do this combo a bit too early. I have to wait a bit for flesh, so I should try to wait a little bit longer. Then, of course, I see the next combo is ready. I do the next combo. Combos are always the priority. And then it's thrust, skill, thrust, skill. Obviously, marked foes also priority if you need to refresh that. That's like the base idea of my rotation. It's combo 1, combo 2, and then thrust, skill, thrust, skill, thrust, skill. And also every time I do combo 2, I like doing thrust sweeping to just add the bleed, and then thrust into that combo. You can see it right there. But also try to fish for the rummage knife. I think I do get the rummage knife at some point, so I just keep using rummage as a pillar, trying to fish for the rummage knife. And another thing I wanted to show here is me doing cutover twice. Like I did cutover with the combo, but I use it again because it's off cooldown, and I'll have it back for whenever flesh comes back. As you can see, I got the rummage knife. Just another bleed added to your damage. 3 damage, always something you should aim for. I do the big combo, I do the mid debuff, then go back to the second combo. It's all about rinse and repeat. Doing your big combo, your secondary combo, and then thrust, skill, thrust, skill, thrust, skill. Where thrust and sweeping advance has main priority, but also the fire pot bleed should be high priority as well. Northwind and the other fire bleed is not that much of a priority, but that's like the baseline idea of my redline rotation. Now we're going to look at the red line trait, the duelist, which is your DPS line for Mariner. And obviously by trading the duelist, you get feint, the skill feint. I'm going to go ahead and trade red. First off, we're going to look into yellow. What do you want to get from the yellow line for your red Mariner? You do want to get the Breath of Fire. It's a free dot that you can apply to your targets. Just put 1 point in there. Putting more points into this is not really worth it. I would also recommend getting 1 point into Vitality. 1500 Vitality is really good value for just 2 trade points. That's it from yellow. We're going to move over to blue. We're going to start off just getting Motivating Song. Nice to have the 10% max morale buff, especially if you don't have a captain in the group. We're going to get 5 points into One with the Sea, increasing the temporary balance buff durations. These durations are either when you get to steady, you get a crit chance buff, you get to 4, you get damage buff, and there's like a defensive one if you go aft as well. It's good to increase the duration of those buffs. Stormy Seas is also good, increasing your extreme balance grace period. This means that if you go into the extreme sides, so either fore or aft, you'll be able to stay there longer before the bad effects apply to you. To unlock the next line, we're going to get the Firm Footing, Steady Movement Speed. If you're in Steady, you get Movement Speed buff. We're going to get 2 points into Cleansing Salt. This gives a 100% chance for your Salt Cure skill, your Corruption Removal skill, to apply an incoming damage debuff of 2.5% to the target every time you remove a corruption. So certainly a handy thing to have. To unlock the next line, we're going to get more points into Steady Movement Speed. On the next line, we're going to get the Frigid North Wind. This gives your North Wind the ability to reduce the crit defense of your target. Definitely want to add that. We also want to get Keen Sight. Gives you a critical chance buff when you get into steady balance. Every time you're in 4 and recenter and go back to steady, you then get a critical chance buff to that buff as well. So pretty handy to have. On the next line, we're going to get Steady Winds, increasing the duration of your wind shanties. As a Red Mariner, that pretty much means North Wind debuff will be a longer duration with the crit defense debuff. This unlocks the Marked Foes, the incoming damage 5% AoE skill that we definitely want to grab. You can hit apply, see that we earned a few more skills. This brings us back over to Redline. Lean Forward, 4 state buff damage, must have, increasing your damage. More damage over time pulses, increasing your damage. 4-play skills damage, increasing your damage, must have. Then we have a Duelist Honor. This is an interesting one. This actually gives you positional damage if you stand in front of your target, not behind. I definitely recommend getting 5 points into this, but I also recommend being careful because you're going to stand in front of your enemies to get that increase in damage. You need to be careful if the enemies have frontal damage, like a frontal attack or any frontal debuffs they apply. So you should definitely have this and definitely stand in front of your enemies when it's safe. But you should also know if it's not safe to stand in front of an enemy. So use this with caution, but definitely something you should get. 15% increased damage if you're standing in front of your target. On the next line, we have Tempered Steel, increasing your crit chance on your melee skills. Definitely a must-have. Salt Sea Blade, must pick, giving you the mitigation debuff skill. Dodge is a skill that I don't really use. The only use of it would be dodge, and then it will enable disengage, giving you the run speed buff and the mitigation buffs, but I don't really use it when I play Mariner. I don't find much use of it. A step back is something that I'm not putting points in because I'm not using check step, so I don't really need this. Attacker's Advantage gives you the bleed for doing thrust into advance, definitely something you want to get. You also want to reduce the cooldown of advance, making it AoE as well. Balance Techniques, this increases the damage of your aftward skills damage, and it's not really something you need. The same thing goes for the Biting North Wind, increasing the damage of your Biting North Wind. It's such a long cooldown that I don't think it's worth putting a point there. I know I'm going to have to use 1 point, one of these 4 traits. If you're a player who likes getting dodge for disengage, you can put the point there. I'm going to put the points in Balance Techniques, giving me 5% more damage whenever I use Feint. Although Feint hits pretty weak, It's still a skill that you use 5 times every time you use North Wind, maybe more, depending on if you prioritize the North Wind. That single point is going to go into balanced techniques. And on the remaining traits, we're going to put the remaining points. Salted Wounds increases the potency of your damage over time effects. Compound Attack, you obviously want to grab this skill, get max damage on it. Conclusive Strike, increasing your finisher skill's damage. As defenses, you want to get 3 points into. Every time you critically hit with your sword plays, you get a damage buff to your sword play skills. And I believe the more points you put into this, the better the buff is. The last 2 points you also want to get. Double Time changes your Shanty Steady 4 into your DPS cooldown. And Confident Lunges gives Bleed 100% chance to Flesh and Lunge, both your finishing skills in red. So this is my recommended trait line for the rotation that I use for the Red Mariner. Time to have a look at the Blue Mariner, the so-called Red Captain line, where you buff your allies but also deal personal damage. So a few things are going to change from red to blue. Like red we just saw, blue is going to be a little bit different but still pretty much the same. So starting at the top 2 lines, we still have the same old, just like in red, we have the Fire Pot, the Breath of Fire, the North Wind to keep up these debuffs. Priority, of course, to the Fire Pot. Breath of Fire, not so much priority. And the North Wind has a little bit of a change in the blue line, whereas it gives a 5% damage buff to your raid. So you definitely want to keep the North Wind off cooldown. The Shanty Steady 4 and Shanty Steady Aft stay the same. This is no longer a DPS cooldown like it is in Redline, and I would definitely recommend using the Steady Aft, just like in Redline. Moving on to the second line from the bottom, it is pretty much the same as Redline, but of course we don't have Feint. We can't do Feint into Compound Attack. So Compound Attack and Lunge are going to be their own thing, and you definitely want to do the Thrust into Compound and then Lunge. You'll get the bleed from Lunge. Take note that your Compound will no longer reduce the cooldown of Lunge. Make sure you wait for Lunge to be fully off cooldown before you do the combo with Thrust into Compound into Lunge. And then of course your usual Recenter, Assault Sea Blade, and then Marked Foes if you have to apply Marked Foes. Make sure you keep it up, 20-second duration. If there's a red cappy with you in the group, then you don't really have to use Marked Foes if it's only one target. But of course, as always in AoE situations, you want to use Marked Foes off cooldown. Replacing Feint is just Repose. Repose is simply going to be a filler skill. When your big combos are on cooldown, you can then fill Repose with Thrust Riposte, just to get some extra damage from that skill. But other than that, your Lunge combo is now Thrust into Compound into Lunge, and then Recenter, Salty Blade. The only change from Redline is that you don't have Feint. Other than that, the combo is the same, only you do Thrust before Compound Attack. The biggest difference in Blue Mariner is of course at the bottom line we have a few new skills. But first let's take a look at our second combo. This used to be Thrust into Aggressive Strike into Cutover and then Flesh in Redline. But we don't have the Cutover skill, we don't have the Flesh skill. So how is this going to work? The answer is that Aggressive Strike turns into a filler skill, just like Riposte. We will do filler Thrust into Aggressive Strike whenever there's nothing else to use. And your second big combo is now gonna be Thrust into Advance as usual to apply the bleed and deal more damage to Advance. Thrust into Advance and Advance into Dramatic Flourish. The reason for this is that Advance will do 2 things to Dramatic Flourish. First, of course, you get the 50% finisher skills damage, making this skill deal more damage, but also a 10% increase to the Dramatic Flourish critical chance potency. And what that means is Dramatic Flourish has a 25% critical hit chance, effects applied to raid meters within 5 meters, duration of 3 seconds. So for 3 seconds, anyone who's close within 5 meters to you will get a 25% critical hit chance boost, really strong buff. And by using Sweeping Advance into Dramatic Flourish, this will increase by 10%, giving you 35% crit chance. for 3 seconds. Very strong buff. Quick mention that both finishers, Dramatic Flourish and Lunge, will both give a 10-second damage buff of 4% to your raid within 40 meters. So your combos in blue will basically be Thrust, Sweeping Advance into Dramatic Flourish. That's your first combo. Second combo will be Thrust into Compound Attack into Lunge. And then of course Recenter and Sulcy Blade and Marked Foes whenever you need it. And then Aggressive Strike and Riposte will be fillers, and you have your maintenance buffs up top. Just remember that in blue you want to use the North Wind kind of off cooldown to refresh the 5% damage buff. You don't have to use it off cooldown. As you can see, the duration is 1 minute 10 seconds on it, but it's nice to use off cooldown because you get the crit defense debuff. So a bit more focus on the North Wind when you play Blue Line Mariner. Of course, we still have the Rummage skill. We still want to hunt for the Jagged Knife Bleed skill. And then we have 4 new buff skills. First off, I'm going to talk about Guided by the Stars. This is more of a defensive cooldown. You can see that it's a long cooldown, almost 4 minutes. And the effect is 30-second duration, where everyone within 40 meters gets 15% single target healing critical chance, 25% incoming healing modifier, 50% crit defense, and also a finesse rating. So this is more of a defensive minded skill, increasing your healing of your raid and incoming healing, basically giving you like a burst window of 30 seconds where you get increased healing on your entire raid and increased healing crit chance for your healers. A pretty strong defensive cooldown right there. When it comes to the 3 other skills, we have the offensive skills. So we have the West Wind, minute 15 cooldown, applies to raid within 10 meters, 15% damage for 20 seconds. All the Banners of War has a 1 minute 10 second, applied to the raid within 40 meters, 25% damage for 15 seconds. So just damage buffs basically for your raid and yourself. And then we have the Breaking of Thangorodrim. This is your Bothies, the Mariner's Oathbreaker's Shame, deals damage, 25% incoming damage for 20 seconds, and also AoE to any targets nearby, 10% for 15 seconds. Has a cooldown of 2 minute 55. So the base idea for blue is still doing your big combos, but also applying your buffs at the right times, as well as keeping up your North Wind. So it is kind of similar to Redline, as in that you still have 2 big combos. You have the Thrust, Compound, Lunge, and you have the Thrust, Sweeping Advance into Dramatic Flourish. So that's the basic idea behind the Blue Line Mariner. And just like we did for Redline, we're going to look at an example Parse. So just like Redline, I start with both Fire Bleeds, mid debuff, I get Marked Foes, then I pop my offensive cooldowns, of course. I go into the Dramatic Flourish combo, then I do the second combo. I do Dramatic first because it gives me the crit chance for 3 seconds. And then it's back to normal. Thrust, skill, thrust, skill, thrust, skill, and then always thrust, sweeping advance when you have it. Thrust, skill, rinse and repeat, refresh Marked Foes, and keep an eye on Lunge when it's off cooldown. Then you do your Thrust, Compound, Lunge, apply your mid debuff, and then of course Dramatic Flourish combo. And both combos are on cooldown. Thrust, skill, rinse and repeat. And then you just time your, you can see that I just got a Rummage Knife as well, pretty lucky with the Rummage. And then it's just all about doing your combos, just like in Redline. But also in blue, you need to kind of think about the timing of your buffs. They're called shanties in blue. You can also notice that every time I use Lunge, it actually reduces the cooldown of my shanty skills. So an interesting thing to take note of, all these buff skills, including the Bothies, are shanty skills, and the North Wind as well. You're going to see when I use Lunge, it's going to reduce the cooldown of all these 3 skills, as well as the North Wind. They skip 3 seconds of their cooldown, meaning that their cooldown for every 15 seconds that their cooldown is, it gets reduced by 3 seconds every time you use lunge. So while the both is like almost 3 minutes on the cooldown, technically it's like 2 minutes 20 seconds or something like that. So the shanties are actually shorter in cooldown. As long as you keep doing your combos, you'll have these buffs back sooner than what the cooldown actually tells you on the tooltip. Another thing worth mentioning, compared to red, I noticed that blue mariner I require a bit more power, and if you don't like have a red captain in your group for inspire or anything like that, there is a simple way to get around this. After doing your lunge combo and recenter, you can then use on guard to restore some power if you need. So as soon as you do the recenter, you can then on guard and then continue with your rotation if you get into power problems. But that's like the basic idea of the blue line rotation. It's pretty much the same as red line, slight modifications for how you do your combos, and also maintain your buffs and apply your damage buffs at good times. So skipping to the end, I believe this Parse ended at 87, I thought it was. Yeah, so 87k. But obviously you can't really compare it to the Red Mariner. Red Mariner does like 85k. With my rotation, it's like 80 to 85k on its own. While Blue Mariner does this, of course, with all these buffs. The Red Mariner does not have all these buffs. Northwind increases your damage. And Blue Mariner also gets the Dramatic Flourish crit chance, which will also increase your DPS by a lot. And of course, one downside is that you don't get the flesh or the flesh bleed. But on the flip side, you do get the Dramatic Flourish, which is a really strong buff. So it's going to be very interesting to see if Blue Mariner can actually make it into the meta. But it seems like it's pretty straightforward to play. So let's try trading in blue line. How would you trade as a Blue Mariner? So looking at the shanty color line, this is where you buff your allies, kind of like a red captain, like we know from before. You earn the skill Dramatic Flourish just by trading into blue. I'm actually going to start off in yellow. I'm going to put 1 point just to get the Breath of Fire. That's it for now. Then we're going to go into blue, get the things that we need in blue. Definitely want to go all the way to the Booming Voice to make the North Wind give us a damage buff. And we probably want to pick up Guided by the Stars as well. We're going to make our way down. So just like we did when we go red-blue, we're going to get Motivating Song. We're going to get the 5 points in the temporary balance buff durations. So the buffs you get every time you enter a fore or steady or aft. You definitely want to get the extreme balance grace period, making it so that you last longer when you're in the extreme sides of the balance. To advance to the next line, we don't really care about the shanty healing, I would say. We're more about damage. We're going to get some steady movement speed to advance to the next line. Cleansing Salts to get the incoming damage debuff on the Salt Cure. Every time you remove a corruption, you will put an incoming damage debuff for 2.5% on the target. Looking at the other traits, we have Step Back damage reduction. We don't really care about this because we're not going to use Step Back that much. And incoming healing, I don't think is that important. So instead, we're just going to get more run speed to advance to the next line. Next line, we could get the South Wind for the run speed buff. I personally prefer saving those points and putting them into red line for more personal damage. So we're going to get the Frigid Northwind for the crit defense debuff on your Northwind skill. Keen Sight, definitely want this. The critical chance buff whenever you go to steady. Relaxing Wind, once again, we don't really care about the self-healing that much from the Wind Shanties. Instead, we're going to get the duration increase on the Wind Shanties. Marked Foes, of course, we're going to get that. And then we put 4 points into the Shanty cooldown reduction. And that brings us to the capstone skills. We definitely want to get the Booming Voice. We get the damage buff to your North Wind skill. And since we have an odd number of points, we just pick up the Guided by the Stars cooldown as well. Now it's time to go into red line. We're going to get the important damage one, 4-state buff damage. We're going to get damage over time pulses. We're going to get swordplay skills damage. We're going to hold off on a Duelist Honor, the positional damage. But instead we're going to go a bit deeper into red melee critical hit chance, 5 points for sure. Then you want to grab the Salt Sea Blade. You want to get attacker's advantage bleed. When thrust into advance gives a bleed. You want to make advance sweeping, making it AoE, but also reducing the cooldown of the skill. We don't get dodge, we don't get step back, we don't get balance techniques, we don't get biting north wind. We do go for salted wounds for more damage on our dots. We definitely want to get the compound attack for the compound into lunge combo. And this leaves us with 8 points. I personally think you just drop this as a blue mariner, and instead you just simply pick up 3 of the finisher skills damage, and you put 1 point in the test defenses buff. Every time you crit, you get a 2% skills damage buff for 5 seconds. So this is probably how I would rate as a blue mariner. Hit apply just to get all the skills. We're going to look at the set bonuses. Inspiring Presence gives your swordplay finishers the Inspire buff, so let's just have a look real quick. 10-second duration, 4% damage every time you use lunge, or every time you use a dramatic flourish. Resonant Song increases the buff durations of your shanties, so all your buffs, like West Wind, all the banners to war, North Wind. The West Wind obviously is a blue skill only, so you get it from the set bonus. This is your damage buff, 15%. Defensive Posture makes your aft buff stronger when you get into aft, but let's be honest, you're always going to be in 4. You want to deal personal damage. Buoying Winds increases the potency on the West Wind and the South Wind, but me personally, I don't really care about the South Wind skill. I'd rather go deeper into red, getting more personal DPS. Banners of War is another buff skill that you earn from being blue. All the Banners of War. And the last trait is, of course, the Bothies, the Breaking of Thangorodrim, the Mariner's version of the Oathbreaker's Shame. So this is how I would trait as a blue mariner. As we could see from my Parse example, does pretty good damage. Seems like it's static, pretty easy to get into rotation. So this is my blue line mariner build. Time to look at the yellow mariner and see what the yellow mariner is all about. The yellow mariner is supposed to be an alternative to either Yellowberg or Yellow Loremaster, so kind of filling one of the support slots. Now, where red and blue were kind of similar in everything they do, yellow brings a lot more CC, a lot of new skills that do something else than DPSing, obviously since you're a support. So we're going to take a look at what Yellow Mariner can bring to the table. Starting on my top bars and second bar, we have the usual damage over time, Fire Pot, Breath of Fire. It's worth noting that your pot skills, like Fire Pot, can be traded to be targetable on the ground, like such. We have the North Wind. If you're playing Yellow Mariner, you probably won't have enough points to get the crit defense debuff. It's not that strong of a debuff, but it's still attack duration debuff on the enemy. Then we have a skill called Jugglery Proficiency, and this is a toggle skill. I have it on my Shift 8, and basically what this does, if you don't toggle it, nothing happens, but if you do toggle it, it changes your haversack skills. So haversack skills will be like Fire Pot that has the skill type haversack on it, and what will change with this skill? The haversack skills will gain the ability to apply lores. And as you can see, the Fire Pot, by toggling the Jugglery Proficiency, Fire Pot does get the 30% chance to apply. And what does this mean? X 0.85. It basically means that your target that has this debuff on it will take 15% less damage, but also deal 15% less damage. So the outgoing damage debuff is just like Fire Lore, Frost Lore for the Lore Master, but there is a downside from applying these lores. You also reduce the damage that you, as a group, deal to that target. So there is a trade-off. If you're using the Mariner's lores. Another thing that's worth noting is that these lores are actually corruptions. Let me see if I can proc it. Did not proc it. Let me keep using haversack skills. As you can see, I did proc it on this one. So Jugglery is actually a corruption. This can actually be removed by anyone. So if I use my Salt Cure, I actually remove the effect. If you're like DPSing a target, it can be really tricky to keep this up. But for me, it seems like jugglery is something you want to apply to make something deal less damage. Like if you're not attacking it, for example in the Gwath, if you're fighting the ads in the last boss, then you can keep the jugglery on the shard so it deals less damage because you're not DPSing the shard at that moment. There's definitely a trade-off if you want to do the jugglery on your haversack skills. So using the jugglery will be kind of tricky. There's also a tracery that will increase the chance. Currently it's 30%. There is a tracery that will take it to 63%, I believe. Something around there, like 60%. So there's also a chance that the effect won't apply. It's kind of tricky to use, in my opinion. But jugglery proficiency is your way to apply, let's call them lores, as a Yellow Mariner. I'm just going to keep this active so we can see which skills will actually apply this if you have it active. As a Yellow Mariner, you can also trade points into your cleansing skill to make it raid wide within 5 meters. So that's pretty nice. On the next bar, we have the typical Shanty Steady 4 and Shanty Steady Aft toggle skills. And there's also a cooldown that you gain, a big heal, giving you some movement speed and temporary damage reduction. It's a 3-minute cooldown, so it's basically a panic heal. Whenever you need some healing, if you're getting low, you can pop the Steady Traveler. Now, before looking at any of the extra new skills that we get in yellow, we're going to be looking at your DPS rotation as a Yellow Mariner. If you don't have any supporting to do, you should try to deal as much DPS as possible. And I would say that the DPS rotation for yellow is pretty similar to a blue line. Obviously, we don't have the feint to do feint into compound into lunge. So instead, we're going to be doing thrust into compound and lunge as your priority chain. So thrust, compound, lunge, and then you recenter, then you apply your Salt Sea Blade. Your other DPS chain would then be thrust into sweeping advance, as we know, giving the advance the bleed and dealing more damage. And then you'd want to do sweeping into draining strike. Draining strike is your new finisher in yellow line. This skill will drain power and also improve the enervating counter effect. We're going to look at that in a minute. But those are your two main chains in yellow. Thrust into compound into lunge is your main priority. Then you recenter Salt Blade. Then you do thrust into sweeping into draining. And riposte and debilitating will be filler skills that you just apply doing thrust, skill, thrust, skill. The same goes for the other skills like Firepot, Breath of Fire, and North Wind. And of course you have Rummage, trying to rummage for the knife, the bleed, or if you want some extra heals as a support, there's also some good skills you can get from that. But that's your, let's say, the main rotation as a Yellow Mariner. So what exactly is the enervating counter effect? So we're going to look at that real quick. I'm going to open a dummy here. This involved the Blade Shield skill, Riposte, and Draining Strike. So using a Blade Shield, as you can see, Riposte increases your target's incoming damage. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Move this here so we can see the dummy. So I'm going to do Blade Shield, then Riposte. You can see the debilitating counter, 5% incoming damage. And now I'm going to be using a Draining Strike. You'll see that Draining Strike actually improves this effect. Makes it 7.5% incoming damage for 30 seconds. So that's another way you can support your group. Blade Shield into Riposte. We'll put the debilitating counter. Then you use a Draining Strike. It will improve this effect and last for longer. So anytime after this is applied, just simply use a Draining Strike again. It will refresh the effect. So always remember, if you're on a new target, Blade Shield Riposte to get the 5% on the target. Obviously, you're going to be doing a Draining Strike, so this debuff should always be active on your target. Once you apply the debilitating, you should be refreshing the better incoming damage debuff by using Draining Strike. With the DPS skills out of the way, it's time to look at your CC skills. From of the Sea works just like Blinding Flash as a Lore Master, where you can daze a target. There's also a Tracery, I believe, to reduce the cooldown of this skill. You get Intimidating Challenge. This is basically a fear you can apply to your target. You'll notice that all these skills are haversack. They can all apply the lores on the target. Throw Bolas is an AoE max target 7, root for 25 seconds. You get volatile salts. This is comparable to the Loremaster's Bane Flare. 20-second daze, but it breaks after 1 second if you damage the target. You can try using this skill, volatile salts. Throw out some salt, and you daze the target for 20 seconds, as we can see. So those are kind of your CC skills. You have one single target daze from Of the Sea. You get the Tracery, the cooldown will be reduced. You have Intimidating Challenge, which is your fear. You have your root skill, which is AoE. Then you have your AoE daze skill, max 7 targets. And at the bottom, we have 2 new Haversack skills. Caustic Brew and Pitch Pot are some of the strongest skills for the Yellow Mariner. Caustic Brew can be compared to the Ancient Craft of the Loremaster. If you apply it to the target, they get the Major Rent debuff. First 10 seconds, they get 15% both mitts, and then it's a 20-second 10% on both mitts. Meanwhile, Pitch Pot can also be applied to the target, giving the minor rent armor debuff for 20 seconds. So Caustic Brew gives the major rent for 30 seconds. Pitch Pot is 20 seconds of minor rent. So hopefully I explained the Yellow Mariner well, like the baseline Mariner rotation. Obviously you're not going to be DPSing as much as a red or a blue Mariner would be doing, but you still have your DPS skills you can be using to help out the group. And you have a lot more CC tools at your disposal, as well as the Caustic Brew and Pitch Pot for strong debuffs on the targets. You can do your Blade Shield into Repulse for the 5% incoming damage. Then you use Draining Strike on the target, increasing that to 7.5% incoming damage. And I should also mention that Debilitating Strike, this is actually Aggressive Strike in blue and red. This changes to Debilitating, and there's something special about this skill. It's a guaranteed lore, and there's no reduced incoming damage. So if there's one target, you can reduce their damage 100%. Cooldown is 9 seconds, so you're going to be able to spread this to like 2 or 3 targets quite easily and keep it up all the time. If you don't want to use the jugglery lores, this is a guaranteed lores, 45-second duration, so definitely something worth keeping in mind. But that's basically how Yellow Mariner works in principle. I should also mention that as of me recording this, Lunge in Yellow will actually go on a 1-minute cooldown. That is a bug, but it should be fixed with a future patch. Just keep that in mind if you're playing this like pretty soon after the video goes live, then this skill might be bugged in Yellow, giving you a super long cooldown, but it should be fixed with the next patch, I believe. Now, it's kind of hard to do a Yellow rotation with the Lunge being bugged for a 1-minute cooldown, but I thought I would just do an opening just to show you guys what you would probably do as a Yellow Mariner, especially for a single target boss fight. So you would probably open with Blade Shield and then Repulse to get the 5% incoming damage. Then you should probably throw your Caustic Brew and your Pitch Pot on the target for the minor and major rent. It always depends on if you have a Burglar or a Loremaster in the group with you that can also apply the major and minor rents. So you kind of want to try to coordinate that. If the Loremasters pops their cooldowns first, then you hold off for like 20-30 seconds before you pop yours. But in any case, your opening should always be Blade Shield, Repulsed to get the 5% incoming damage on the target. Then you might consider popping your Fire Bleeds on the target, mid debuff for sure. Then you can go into your rotation. So obviously you want to get the bottom rotation first to get a Draining Strike to upgrade your incoming damage debuff. Then you do your Compound into Lunge with the Recenter, mid debuff, and then it's all about just the thrust skill. And of course you use your pots whenever needed. But you can see that Lunge is on a really long cooldown. So it's kind of pointless for me to do a full rotation here without Lunge. But you get the idea. The principle is the same as red and blue, where you do your 2 chains and then recenter after using Lunge. Keep up your Fire Bleeds, keep your mid debuff on the target. Decide if you want to have the jugglery applied. Always make sure if there's a new target to attack that you do your Blade Shield into Repulse for the 5%, and then Draining Strike to upgrade to 7.5%. Use your Pitch Pot and your Caustic Brew whenever needed for the group. And of course, if there's CC that needs to be doing, and of course, if there's any CC that you need to be doing, you always have your days, single target days, you have your fear, you have your AoE root skill, you have your, let's call it the Bane Flare, volatile salts. There's definitely some potential in Yellow Mariner, and it seems like it could do just fine, replacing either the Lore Master or the Burglar as a support for the group. The time has come to look at the yellow trait line. So the Rover is your, let's call it the Yellow Lore Master / Yellow Burglar, and just by trading the Rover, you earn Draining Strike and Thrum of the Sea. So Draining Strike is a finisher skill that drains power from the target, and Thrum of the Sea is your single target days skill. So we're just going to start with yellow. Yellow, I think you actually have a bit of flexibility. I'm just going to pick what I would prefer, but there's definitely flexibility where you can go in different ways depending on the fight. But this is what I would trade. I would definitely get the Entangling Lines to get the Throw Bolas. This is your root skill, AoE skill. Can be pretty nice to have in certain situations. We're going to go all the way to the right, get 1 point in Spitting Spirits to get the Breath of Fire skill for some extra damage. The Shocking Counterattack will give the ability for your Riposte into Advance to deal a stun. And I don't think it's really needed, so we're just going to put points into Vitality instead. Gets a bit more survivability. On the next line, we have Rare Ingredients, and I think you should get all 3 points here. This will make your Belly of Brine, your cleansing skill, will make it raid wide as long as you're close to the members that you're cleansing. Ragged Knife, I think, is an optional skill that you could consider getting. It's a range throwing knife, 1 minute cooldown. And since it's a haversack skill, it has the ability to apply the jugglery to the target, the lures. But it's not a thing I think you would need generally. So I'm not going to pick that in my yellow line. Encouraging Presence gives you more outgoing healing, always nice to have. Fighting Smarter improves your aft buff. Whenever you get into aft, you will then get a stronger aft buff, 5% stronger. So we're going to put some points into that. Let's go 4 points. We're going to hold off with the outgoing healing for now. Definitely going to get the mitigations, 2.5 mits for both mitigations. Bitter Northwind makes your Northwind skill reduce incoming healing on the target. Not something we really need in a lot of situations. The Many Hands gives your shanties a chance to restore power. And this feels like something that is not really needed. If your group is struggling with power, you could always be getting this trait, where you can put 3 points into this for the power restorations on your shanties. Strong Arms is also something you can debate if you want to get, because it leads into Careful Aim, which makes your thrown skills ground targeted. I'm just going to apply it for now. I'm going to get some outgoing healing. So Careful Aim makes your thrown skills ground targeted. Let's just look at an example here. For example, your Fire Pot, instead of applying to the target, gets thrown on the ground instead. Same goes for your other pot skills. You can target them on the ground. So this is certainly something you can consider. If you want to have the thrown skills like targeted on the ground, you can do that. If not, you just don't get this. Intimidating Challenge gives you your fear. You definitely want to get that. Coordinated Movement, I don't think you really need this. Novel Compounds gives you the Volatile Salt skill, so 1 point for sure into that just to get the skill. And at this point, we want to get to the next line, so we can consider more points into Novel Compounds to increase the grace period before damage will break the Volatile Salts. Or you can go for some outgoing healing or some more vitality. I think I like the grace period. I'm going to put 3 points into that. You could also consider making this skill maxed out, making your Breath of Fire a bit stronger. But since we're not going to get as much damage potential as we would with the red or blue, I prefer putting just 1 point into this and instead getting 3 points into Compounds for the increased days grace period. Next up, we have Enervating Counter. This make your Blade Shield into Riposte, apply the 5% incoming damage to the target, and you can improve it to 7.5 by using Draining Strike, so definitely something you want. You want to get Masterful Disarm. One use of this is doing Advance into Debilitating Strike to disarm your opponent, but mainly the reason to get this is to reduce the cooldown of Debilitating Strike by 6 seconds. And at the bottom we have your healing cooldown, Steady Traveler, and you have a Watched Pot, giving you the ability for your crits to reduce the Haversack skills cooldown by 1 second. You definitely want to get that as well. Now me personally, I want to go a bit into blue here. I want to get the temporary balance buff durations to make your balance buffs last longer. For example, the damage buff you get for getting into 4. So you definitely want to get the increase for that. And I also think you should get the extreme balance grace period. You can spend more time in the extreme area without getting the bad effects. Now you could also get motivating song, but it's something you can actually drop. You don't have to have it. If you have a captain in your group, you don't really need that. If there's another mariner, you don't really need it. So as a yellow mariner, it's something you don't have to get in my opinion. I'd rather get the extra points in red. In red, we're going to try to buff our DPS as much as possible. Force state buff damage, all points. Damage over time pulses, all points. Short place skills damage, all points. We're not going to get positional as Yellow Mariner. Tempered Steel for the melee crit chance. We're going to get Soul Sea Blade for the mitigation debuff. Definitely getting Attacker's Advantage for the Thrust into Advanced Bleed. Slashing Blade, reduce the cooldown of Advance. And this leaves us with 2 more points. We definitely want to get the Compound Attack skill. Now the question is, where does the last point go? We have the option of increasing your damage over time. You can increase your compound attack by a little bit more. But I think we're going to go for dodge as a general trait line. If you don't feel like you need dodge, you don't have to get this. But I'm just going to do it. It fills out a pretty good standard general trait line. But like I said, there's a lot of flexibility in yellow, depending on the fights and what you need. I think this is really good to get from blue. You could always get the motivating song. And in red line, if you feel like you can do something differently, you can always do that. But I think this is good for a general yellow trait line. Let's take a look at the set bonuses you get for being in yellow. The first trait set bonus gives you the Caustic Brew skill. Extended Stupor increases your days and route durations. Explosive Lunge gives the lunge skill an ability to do a fellowship maneuver. So if you do Debilitating Strike into lunge, it goes on a 1-minute cooldown, but you get a fellowship maneuver. But currently, like I said, the skill is bugged. Even if you do Compound Attack into lunge, it will go on a 1-minute cooldown. But that's an option you have in yellow, that you can do Debilitating into lunge for the CJ. Pitch Pot is your minor rent skill that you also get for being in yellow. Rare herbs seem to be adding heals to your cleansing skills. So either Belly of Brine or Cleansing Spirits if you trade into that. Not only does it cleanse the effects, but it also heal depending on the effect that you clear. Corrosive Salts is basically like the Enfeeble for Loremaster, where Caustic Brew is 15% for the first 10 seconds and then 10% for the remainder of the time. Your Jugglery Proficiency is of course your toggle skill, giving you the ability to apply lores with your Haversack skills. So this is my recommended standard yellow line build. Of course, there are many different ways to trade, but I think this works just fine as a general build. If you enjoyed the video, please consider dropping a like and subscribing as it really helps out the channel. And if you like LOTRO, I would really recommend joining my Discord servers. You can also support me directly through my Ko-fi website. If you're playing or looking to play Lord of the Rings online, there is one place you need to be. The Ghyniverse is a Discord server created for the community of the players of Lord of the Rings Online. The server is getting close to 7,000 members, and in this server you'll find tons of helpful information. There's monthly giveaways, easy access to patch notes, you can keep up with my YouTube videos, my streams. If you're a streamer, you can ask for the streamer role and you can announce your streams in the other stream channel. There are discussion channels for pretty much everything, every class, monster players. But the best thing about this server is probably the Gearing Resources tab, where you can find anything from trait lines for every class, every build. There are stat goals, where you can find out what stats you should aim for on your characters. Really helpful information about drop rates from instances, as well as screenshot from all the new loot that appears in the game. If you enjoy LOTRO, you should definitely consider joining this server, and hopefully I'll see you in Middle-earth. If you were part of the Ghyniverse already, you might have noticed that another tab appeared at the top, the LFF server. This server is a brand new server that I created, the LFF Ghyniverse. In this server, you can select which servers you want to keep up with, and once you select your server, say you select Arkenstone, you will see the LFF, the kinship advertisement, looking for kinship and trade channels, and there's also voice channels if people want to use those. The LFF channel is basically a looking for fellowship channel where people can post if they need players for the runs, and this way people don't have to be logged into the game to see the chat, they can just instead get a notification on their Discord. There's also a kinship advertisement page where kins can post their kinship advertisement and have people join their kins. And you can also post in the looking for kinship chat if you're looking for a kinship, but make sure to take a look in the kinship advertisement first and look through all the kin to find a suitable kin for you. There's also a trade channel if people want to buy or sell stuff that you can use. Hopefully you'll consider joining this server to bring the community even more together, not just in the game, but also outside of the game.